Okay, this is part 3 on chapter 5, Germany's defeat in World War II. We have already covered America's entrance into World War II with its contribution of vast resources and manpower, as well as its collaboration of military strategy contributing to the defeat of Germany. We also looked at how Germany contributed to its own defeat through its ineffective command structure, inappropriate use of resources and military funds, heavy reliance on petrol, and having war on two fronts. Now, for this final part, we shall look at Allied resistance, okay, and how it actually contributed to the downfall of Germany. Let's begin. Now, the reorganization of the Soviet Union was important, okay, because the Soviet Union and its Red Army were credited as being the decisive force for Allied victory. Okay, while a lot of historians have said that America's entrance into the war was important, there are also another group of historians that talk about the importance of the Soviet Union and its role. It defeated about 80% of the German forces on the Eastern Front, which is a huge number, 80%. Now, on the 22nd of June 1941, Germany broke the treaty with Soviet Union and invaded it. Okay? Because of that, the Soviet Union formed a military alliance with Britain, and the Soviets, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, they were actually unprepared for the German invasion. Now, Hitler had a very cool war strategy called the Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. Okay, as the name suggests, it was used to describe Nazi war plans and tactics because the strategy involved a lot of speed and surprise, and because of this, they were able to conquer a lot of areas very, very quickly. Now, the Soviet Union eventually gained the upper hand, learning from its mistakes, because there were errors made by the Germans, with strong resistance from Soviet troops and weather. Yes, the weather was one of the reasons for Hitler's downfall, because the bitter Russian winters actually gave the Soviet Union a lot of time to reorganize its army, to rebuild its economy and military production. Okay, it took advantage, if you recall earlier, of the American Lend-Lease aid. Now, Stalin himself said that without American production, the United Nations could never have won the war. Of course, this was Stalin's way of saying, yeah, without the help of the Germans, the Russians wouldn't have won the Soviet Union wouldn't have won the war. But of course, he would be too egotistical to say this out loud. So let's look at an overview here. Now, earlier on we talked about Germany's weaknesses. So I'm just going to concentrate on the Soviet Union's strategies. Okay, they learned from their mistakes, they gave control to experienced generals, and they got rid of the inexperienced and incompetent ones. They made use of the harsh winters to rebuild and reorganize, and they moved their major industrial plants to central and eastern Russia. Why? Because it was further away from where the Germans were. And all resources were devoted to military production. Okay, so basically they made none of the mistakes which the Germans made. Secondly, let's take a look at the British resistance to German invasion. As the only Allied country that left in Europe, they played an important part. Now, Hitler had never planned for a war with the British people. When France fell, he assumed that the British would be forced to talk about peace terms with the Germans. Instead, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made it clear that he wanted to fight the Germans right to the end and prepared the British for war. And here we go, Winston Churchill. Now, as we discussed in one of the previous lectures, he was one of the few British politicians who realized the dangers of appeasement, and he disagreed with Neville Chamberlain's Munich Agreement. In the summer of 1940, Germany had attacked Britain in a series of battles known as the Battle of Britain. Okay, and as we discussed earlier, he ordered the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, to weaken the British Royal Air Force. But of course, things didn't go quite as planned. At first, they attacked British coastal defences and airfields. But one of the German bombers accidentally bombed outskirts of London, which is a civilian area, okay, which is not an important target. Britain retaliated, sought revenge by making bombing raids on Berlin, which is the capital of Germany. Hitler then decided to change the focus of attacks to British cities instead, as a form of revenge. Okay, and because of this silly move, because the Luftwaffe was not attacking the British Royal Air Force, it actually gave them time to repair their airports. And even though the British cities containing civilians were bombed by the Germans, it didn't demoralize them, but rather boosted their morale instead. A few months later, Hitler made preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay, even though this British Royal Air Force problem wasn't solved yet. And the following year, okay, he stopped attacking Britain and focused on the Soviet Union instead. Okay, now we have a picture of a British city after it has been bombed, after suffering a German air raid. Okay, so if you can see, it's quite horrible, and I have no idea why their morale was strengthened. They must be very strong people. So there were resistance movements in other countries as well. Now, resistance were provided by people who were not part of the army. That means these were citizens, civilians in the country. Okay, they're not soldiers. They provided important information and behind-the-line support to the Allies. Okay, like some of the examples of how they provided support was giving the Allies information about the location of the Nazi soldiers, so they could attack them by surprise. The Yugoslav, Polish, and Soviet resistance movements, as well as the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle, were among the most important, prominent of these movements. Here we see a picture of Charles de Gaulle, who would later become the president of France. Now, why was the resistance so important? They actually contributed in blowing up the railway stations belonging to the Nazis and sabotage Nazi factories so that they couldn't build the weapons or ammunition which they needed. They also gave false information to the enemies. Okay, they gathered intelligence or intel. Like I said, intelligence refers to the location of enemies, their factories, etc., etc., etc. And when the Germans retreated, they actually joined in the attack. So here we see Soviet resistance fighters behind German front lines in Belarus. Okay, so again, these are not your soldiers, people who signed up for the war. These are normal, ordinary civilians who decided to fight for the country. Okay, with that, we've come to the end of part 3. Let me just summarize what we have covered so far. We have learned about number 1, Allied resistance led to the defeat of Germany because of the reorganization of Soviet Union, which allowed them to regroup in order to defeat Germany. Secondly, British resistance to German invasion. And lastly, resistance movements, such as the one we've just covered. Right, thank you for listening.